So I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about SBOM everywhere. My name's Kate Stewart. I work at the Linux Foundation, but I've also been involved with the SPDX project pretty much since the start, and have also been involved with a lot of the NTA and now CISA efforts about SBOM, defining what SBOMs are and so forth. So how many people in the room, I love being able to do this in person now finally again, know what an SBOM is? Okay, I'm going fast through the first few slides then. And we can certainly dive into ask any questions you've got and so forth. But obviously, we're all here because of this. Vulnerabilities happen, and people need to know if their products are affected. And we all know that supply chain attacks are growing up, courtesy of the software supply chain. So not only is it important to know what's in the product, it's also important to know what is building your product as what is you're depending on with your product, because that's all part of your software supply chain. And so some of these things have not been as visible in the past, and we need to be looking at that. And obviously, it's pretty quick for a developer to fix a vulnerability once they're known. However, the cost to remediate for users is the large problem. So giving them bandwidth and time to make these fixes is something that we're going to have to take care of in the industry. And part of that's going to be, how do we get that? Now, various surveys, including the one the LF did last year, 98% are using open source today is what we're finding. And about 95% are concerned about software security. So how concerned they are and how much they're taking action, obviously, I think the prior speaker gave a pretty good summary of it. But we need to look at how to make this forward. Other surveys are sort of backing up these types of numbers. Synopsis's survey is also sort of saying open source is there, and it's a large part of the code bases. So part of that survey that was done last year, the number 2 action was use SBOMs to better secure the source code. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You just need to know what's there to know if you have a problem or not. And so we really have not had the discipline in the industry consistently to make some of these things available at scale. And that's where we need to go to, right? We need to get this stuff up to scale. And so one of the big factors that was helping to motivate adoption of SBOMs was there were some work groups going on in NTIA since 2018 to last year. And most of that, the inertia from that group is moving over to CISA to help move it forward. And this is coming out of their FAQ. And it's just basically what are the relationships between the components used in building the software. And these can be like libraries, modules, source files, proprietary thing. It doesn't need to be open source. It doesn't need to be anything. You just need to have a way of describing it in a way that the tooling can consume it at scale. And so that's what we're really aiming for right now, is how do we get to that scale point? And there are things that are known, i.e. I know all the pieces that are connecting to me, and there are things that are unknown. And that's also an important distinction. Like, do I have risk here? If you don't know you've got closure on all your dependencies, you potentially have risk of not knowing something. And so figuring out how we can get that standardized in an effective form is one of the challenges we have. Being able to be explicit and be able to potentially link from one SBOM to another SBOM to sort of be able to trace a full flow back. These are the challenges because of it's so fast to build open source right now, the DevOps side, things like that. Being able to, every time you do a build, you pretty much need to have a SBOM generated, so you really can track yourself down through time. And we're not quite there yet. We're getting better. Part of the motivation that's happening for this is the executive order came out last year from the government. And when we did the survey towards the end of the year, almost 80% of the companies said that that did the survey for us, said they'd be using SBOMs this year. Now, most of them are just producing. There's still weaknesses on the consumption side, and then taking that information to make effective decisions. There's still work to be done on the production side too, to get to scale and to be efficient and robust and hardened. But the starting points are there in both places. And there is now economic motivators from the executive order to do it, but we're also seeing in Europe here, there's a lot of legislation coming out that's expecting SBOMs as well. So it's not just a US phenomenon, it's pretty much a worldwide. And the awareness of the vulnerability in the supply chains is what's really motivating a lot of changes that hadn't been happening before. So one of the questions is, well, what is a minimum SBOM? What is an SBOM? The NTI came out with a definition after there was a multi-stakeholder stuff that went from 2018 to 2021, and then they did their own little listening session explicitly. And most of the recommendations from that multi-stakeholder were taken in, but they did factor out a few things. And so at the heart of it, there's some data fields that you're expected to have. There is some support, you should be able to take in support for automation and some formats that were recognized for that. And then there needs to be certain practices, things like that, depth, the known unknowns, the distribution delivery. All of these are areas that there's things that we need to complement these SBOMs with to have a working ecosystem. So that minimum SBOM, that gets you a starting point, but there's a lot more information people want to capture than just those minimum fields. However, if you want to call yourself an SBOM, you have to have at least these. Okay, that's kind of where the industry seems to be gelling around at this point in time. And so understanding, when it was created, who created it, what are the relationships that are there, and they just have simple relationships. And here, there's a lot more richer set that we really kind of need for having true knowledge. Then there's various identifiers and versioning of the component and the component. Now, a component is deliberately ambiguous. It's a unit of software. This could be a source file. This could be a binary. This could be an output of a build. Anything that potentially a library, firmware image, whatever, that's a component. And how you assemble these things together is what gives you the knowledge. And so there's a software lifecycle that we start to play with it nowadays. It's not we play with it, but this has been dominating ourselves. And at different stages in the software lifecycle, you need different types of information. And so one of the challenges we need to work through as a wider community is coming up with some common terms so that we're not talking past each other. A lot of the discussions I've been participating in the last few years are people sort of, I know about this and this is what I want to talk about. And this software, Chandran basically contributed the software to that survey a couple years ago. And I think it pretty much sort of shows the scale of the problem. There's been a slightly revised version of it that Bob Martin helped work on, talking about retiring and end-of-lifing. And so, but what we have is we have effectively, go here, am I getting the cursor there? Yeah, I'm getting the cursor, good. When you're planning and you're basically looking at, bringing in software that you're going to combine into your product procurement and, initial development, you're going to want to know what you're bringing in. And so these are either usually source SBOMs, or there may be an analyzed third-party SBOM. So if someone gives you a binary, you're bringing it in, you've got no other information, you're going to maybe throw it through a binary analysis tool to understand what your risks are if you're going to use it. It's all risk-based decisions. But having those pieces of input before you build your product from there will give you your sort of starting point for having confidence. And then as you go through the build and rebuild and DevOps cycles, you'll be creating these build SBOMs. And there's different types of evidence and testing evidence you may want to track with it that's beyond just the minimum. But there's certain common things that you may want to track, and so, but you want to at least have at the end of the day, here's all the dependencies, here's my product, here's my dependencies, and then here's my linkage back to the sources, whatever. And then from that, we have another concept of type of SBOM effectively that's emerged, which is a runtime SBOM or a deployed SBOM. And this is which configs were turned on when I deployed this product in my organization. Because depending on which configs were turned on, a vulnerability may be reachable or not. And there's no point in remediating something if your vulnerability isn't reachable. It's just a lot of work that potentially introduces more vulnerabilities. So being able to be authoritative at each point in this life cycle of software requires different tooling. So we have different tooling that's coming into play here. The type of tool that will generate a source SBOM is different than the type of tool that will generate your configured runtime SBOM. And we have needs for all of these to get SBOMs everywhere, so that we have true line of sight as to what do I need to fix. So this brings us to the SBOM Everywhere SIG at OpenSSF. And so where this came about is there was a security mobilization plan that happened earlier in the year, and Brian's been talking about that already. And we have SBOM everywhere as a specific element of that. And so what we're looking at is, okay, what does it take to get SBOMs throughout this life cycle and throughout the ecosystem? And to get open source tooling there so we can do this robustly and cheaply. Okay? My definition, Kate's personal definition of this is, I want to change one line in my build, and I want to have a coherent SBOM out of there. I want to have one command line to generate things, one way or the other. I'm not quite sure what it needs to look like for a deployed SBOM, but it needs to be simple, because if we don't make it simple, it's not going to happen. So getting us to this SBOM everywhere, we need to figure out how to make this simple. We need to figure out how to put the tooling in place. We need to figure out how to make the tooling robust. Because there's a lot of prototypes out there, but building up consensus and trust in these tools is the stage we're in right now, and we have various efforts that are starting in that direction. So this stream 9 is approving the tooling and then approving the training so it makes it easy for people to use. This is what we were looking at as part of this stream. And we had meetings in DC in May. And then after that, we started over the summer meeting regularly as a group as part of the tooling special interest group. The tooling working group under OpenSSF. So this is a SIG under the tooling working group right now. And so we meet every 2 weeks. In fact, the meeting's happening right about now, actually, over in North America. So it's time zone friendly for Europe as well. And what we're trying to do is make sure the security use cases are well documented, and then making sure that the formats and standards can basically support them, and then the tools are available to that. That's kind of what we're going for. And so the approach we're looking at is getting those requirements cleaned up, okay? Everyone has, like I say, trying to get past everyone talking past each other with what their use cases are, and having them documented in a common understanding. That gives us a set of requirements so that we can make sure that the various tools satisfy or don't satisfy certain types of requirements. And then we can basically look at creating a taxonomy where people can find things, having them out in the open source, and then having education on how to use those tools to satisfy those requirements. People are going, okay, how about use this tool? How do I do this playbook? How do I do this task? We don't have good documentation out there today. And so that's kind of what the SIG is looking at. So there was some initial goals put forward, and we're sort of starting to work on the first few of that. SPDX is part of this, and we're sort of committed as part of the project from SPDX to work on the security profile to satisfy this. And so there is the SPDX community that's working on this, and there's various people here from that community. And in fact, I think I see Thomas at the very back of the row. He's leading the security profile from the SPDX group. And so if you've got to sort of talk about that, but we are wanting to work here to make sure that we can make SPDX effective for this type of thing. And then having these freely, widely available tools, like the command line interpreters, things like that. And then, trying to get package managers out there and effectively used. Nisha's working on one of the online tools, and she's here and happy to talk. And yes, 5 minutes, okay. And so we've got a variety of other people. So this is work that's in progress. There's people starting to work on these topics now, as well as in the SIG meeting, trying to define the requirements, which is what we had agreed to from Washington. If you want to get engaged, we're up on GitHub under the OpenSSF repository, the security tooling, and you will see us down here, and there's an open mailing list. People are welcome to subscribe, especially if you've got use cases you want to make sure are represented. Please do. Please subscribe, and then please start looking at as things emerge and put comments in. And if you can attend the meeting, great, but start to provide your inputs is what we're looking for. And so where we are as a group, I've got links here. The SBOM use cases for security. That's when we're trying to get those use cases documented, requirements there. There's a template for SBOM tooling. One of the people say, one of the things we're hearing is, okay, well, how do I have the tool to do this? Well, landscapes are a solution we've used in other projects. We're going to try to apply a landscape here and have various filtering criteria. So trying to define which filters we want to care about, and then classify these tools against these filters so that people can find tools that they want to use for certain purposes. I think that's generally where we're going. And then the other thing that's work in progress, thank you very much to the OpenSSF. there is now some funding allocated for getting our Python libraries and SPDX cleaned up and refactored. They had gotten rather crufty, to put it mildly, for 2.2. And so the 2.2 and 2.3 versions of SPDX, we have a team working on that, and they'll be working on being visible in the open source as they're evolving, improving the tooling library for Python. We've got a pretty good Java library already. It's up to date with the 2.3, and there's some work going on. I think Brandon is working with the Go libraries and so forth. So we've got different languages for having libraries and standard interfaces into using this so that people can just generate the new versions. And with that, that's pretty much all I've got. So I think I'm within my 5-minute limit. 4 minutes. Do anyone have questions? Go for it.
What do we do when our whatever tools we use cannot really produce an accurate picture? So you build an SPDX based on something, and usually you don't supposed to do it manually. It's not scalable. And since it's a kind of a tree, so if you make one mistake, it trickles over the place.
Yeah.
And you have a judgment on it. The SPDX has to be reproducible. So what happens eventually when I'm trying to work with that and I have partial information?
So having partial information, I think it's a function of the tools that you're working with, and the tools need to be hardened. We have, in SPDX, we'll probably have one this fall. We'll have effectively what we call a bake-off or a doc fest, and we want to have anyone who's having tools that are producing output that's wrong come and compare with other tools on the same input so that we can understand the semantics, are they correct or not. It's a problem with semantics at this point in time because everything is interpretation. If you're not following certain things in certain directions, or you interpret things at a certain level, it's a tooling issue, okay? It's not a spec issue, is the tool doing the right thing or not? And you need to judge it against another tool to make sure that there's coherence between the tools. So I think it's a tool hardening problem, and I think documenting against the tool that you're working with that there's an issue, and what you think the issue is, and starting to work with the tool, either vendor or community, to refine things when you see issues, we'll eventually get to the stage where we have full reproducibility across multiple iterations. Thomas, did you have a comment?
If you look, for instance, at Docker, making an SBOM for Docker is nearly impossible, because Docker itself does not retain metadata. So in this case, it's basically go also to the build tools, and the data, it's not only Docker, there's multiple build tools where the metadata for generating SBOM is simply not maintained. So how am I to create an SBOM tool if the tool itself doesn't provide me the data?
Yeah, so some of the data is in there. The other thing I will encourage you to do is on Thursday afternoon, Nisha's having an SBOM BOF, SBOM tooling BOF, and so looking for gaps and where we need to work on the tooling. So I would encourage you probably to go and show up at that BOF and start going into the details with Thomas and Nisha and others about what the issues are. Okay, any other questions quickly? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's outlined in the minimum elements of an SBOM for the U.S. Department of Commerce. Dependency relationship.
Yep.
Obviously, extremely vague and all-encompassing.
Yep.
And how many layers? Like, are you
So the NTIA stuff was basically saying you must have at least one layer down. Okay? Realistically, you want as much information as you can get, and if you don't have the ability to do the layers down or further partial layers, you need to signal it explicitly that it's an unknown. And so, and that's an area where the tooling really hasn't caught up to what should be done, from my perspective at least. So having the known unknowns I was referring to earlier, there's ways of specifying that explicitly in SPDX, and if it's not explicitly specified, it's assumed as known. However, there's ways of signaling that you do have unknowns there, but the tooling isn't generating that much. Go ahead, Brian.
From a common sense point of view, I would also respond to that with how many layers down did Log4j stop being a problem?
True. And I think we had one more question quickly we'll squeeze in.
Hi, just wondering about the automation tools for generating SBOM at runtime. Is there much there?
Yeah, there's not that much on the there's not that much in the general open source space right now. I'm seeing a lot in the proprietary space. I think we need to basically define what we all are agreeing to in the runtime space and which configs we want to track. I think we can do a lot of what it needs right now with the spec as is, at least on the SPDX side. But I think we do want to have some industry-wide people who care about runtime SBOMs and the configs, what they want to see, and make sure that we establish a set of best practices for generating that, and then encourage the tooling to do that too. No, it doesn't. For instance, I've got, one of the projects, I've got Zephyr that I work with a lot, as part of its build flow. So it's C++. You're generating out 3 SBOMs automatically from one line change in your build. 2 sources, one for the Zephyr sources, one for the app sources, and then a third for the build, which is all the .os that actually made it in from those sources into your final binary. Things like that, or in Yocto, again, that's part of the whole build the recipes, build the tool chain, build everything. But there are cases out there in the embedded space that are showing it, that you can do this automatically. It doesn't just mean package managers. SBOMs are needed for embedded too, and I've got a talk on that on Thursday as well. And I think with that, I'm out of time, right? Okay, thank you very much.